This program is brought to you in part by City Winery.
Welcome back to Books du Jour. My panel today is something I've been looking forward to because they are very interesting book about controversial topics and mostly about the physicality of the human journey. And let me get started with Giovanni Frazzetto, an Italian writer who lives in Berlin at the moment. Although you wrote that you were in England, right? Joy, Guilt, Anger and Love. That was written in English, you said, right? Even though you're Italian. Okay, make the case, right? The Sport Genes, David Epstein, which is about the inside of science of extraordinary athletic performance. Pretty controversial book as well. And David Howitt, Hit Your Call, which is more about the psychology of the human journey. Yeah. Now maybe we can get started with you because before you hit your own call, you did not hear the phone call ringing for you, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for all of us, we're born in what Joseph Campbell, the late, great, king of mythology, would say is the known world. So for me, I was born in Michigan. I lived in a culturally Jewish home, and that's what I understood the world to be. And for really the first probably 20 plus years of my life, I just sort of went down that path. That's what I thought my life and journey was going to be. It just meant, either in my world, it was either becoming a lawyer or a doctor or an executive. You went to a great four-year college, you studied hard, you went to grad school, you went out and got a job and made a lot of money and had a family. And all along, while pursuing that and frankly doing it quite well, there was a voice inside me that was hinting, whispering maybe, that there was another path, something else that maybe I was meant to do. The Buddhists would say your dharma. But I did everything I could to quiet that voice. What mythology tells us, and my life has shown, when we do that, when we pick up the universe's call, that's when the magic starts to happen.
But it's mythology. So do we need that concept to become someone? Because it's helpful. I mean, religion, to some extent, plays the same part, gives you a moral structure.
Right.
Do you feel like we use mythology the same way?
I think we should use mythology more than we do. Joseph Campbell, who wrote a number of books, with his premier book being The Hero with a Thousand Faces, basically said mythology is the collective consciousness reduced to stories. That they're roadmaps, they're guides, they contextualize the tough issues that we all deal with, And if we read them as a map, as a guide, they're instructive. So the one myth that Campbell found that sort of was pervasive in every religion, spiritual belief, all time, and in all geography, he referred to as the hero's journey. Very formulaic. It always follows the same trajectory. If you look at the hero's journey and the various key parts of that map, you can overlay it against your life and make informed decisions about where you are or where you're not. And then we can get into the constructs that can help us heed our call, and in doing so, live a life of purpose and meaning and abundance.
Yes. Can we break down the code of those mythical patterns in our brain?
There are certain limitations to what neuroscience can tell us about emotions.
Yeah.
And that is especially in the case of the experience of emotions.
Yeah.
And that is why I decided to tell stories about emotions that I drew inspiration from my everyday life, and I made a comparison between the scientific experimentation and things that happen to me on a daily basis, and tested when neuroscience was of help to understand my emotions, and when I needed help from the arts and the humanities, philosophy, literature.
That's right. Yeah. You watched the Olympics, yeah, and when you see like the Dutch team in speed racing or speed skating winning all the medals, almost all of them, can we make the argumentation that the psyche is all about psyche and how we control it and our emotion?
all about psyche? No. In fact, I think one of the Dutch secrets, I don't want to get too deep in the physiology, but they use a system called polarized training that they've developed over the last 40 years. It's a very specific type of training that others haven't caught up with, where you basically don't do anything of moderate intensity. You do things that are either really low intensity or things that are really high intensity. You don't do that. So actually, Dutch speed skaters now spend less time in training than they did 40 years ago.
Really?
But they do this kind of polarized training. In the Winter Olympic sports especially, right? Most of these sports, very few countries are really competing in and very few people have access to, right? So a lot of it, and some countries that have put money toward talent identification, what's called talent transfer, taking athletes from sports where they're just kind of good and putting them in something else where based on their physiology they can be great, that works like crazy in winter sports because the competitive pool is small and there's a lot known about the physiology that works, right? So I write about this so-called 10,000 hour rule in my book a lot. That's really driving sports specialization among kids younger and younger. But what the science shows is that actually the typical pattern for an elite athlete is what's called a sampling period early on, where they expose themselves to a bunch of different stuff, find what fits both their mentality and physiology, and eventually focus in later. The people who plateau at sub-elite actually are the early specializers, practicing much more. And so I think there is something to reaching out beyond what sort of just seems to be your narrow world. And so, we'll tell these sort of the myth of Tiger Woods, right? Those guys are unicorns. They almost don't exist. The normal path...
Because what? Is it the genetic makeup? Is it the mind? What is it?
It's hard to know for him. So
it's a God's gift.
First of all, he was physically precocious. He could balance on his father's palm at 6 months old, right? So that doesn't mean he's going to go on to be a great golfer, but he was physically precocious. And the story is often told as his father was driving him to practice. Not the case. You can ask Tiger about it. He'll say, I was the one driving my parents to manipulate the environment around me to allow me to practice. And that's the pattern that prodigies always show, the so-called rage to master. They basically drive the adults around them crazy because they force their environment to be manipulated. And there's no evidence that parents can impart that kind of rage to master. So it seems like something you sort of have or you don't, but the vast majority of elite athletes are more like a Roger Federer, where their parents are pulley rather than pushy. They're saying, don't, keep trying different things until you find your right fit and only zone in later. And I think that in some ways relates to your idea of exposing yourself to different things, reevaluating as you go before you sort of focus in.
No, absolutely agree, and I think that's a great insight. In talking about Tiger Woods or Federer, in Heed Your Call, I talk a bit about this notion of archetypes in mythology, and that, like mythology, archetypes are there for us to look at and what they represent. You can invoke an archetype. You can choose to sort of pattern after an archetype, and they're each different. So, the archetype of, I'd say, Nike, not the goddess, but the brand, is the sort of Roman approach to sports. You don't win silver, you lose gold. The individual athlete, the Tiger Woods, the Lance Armstrong, naming buildings after athletes. It's very sort of Roman in its approach, and that archetype comes with a lot of different sort of bells and whistles, where Adidas or Adidas, not better or worse, but their archetypal approach is more the Greek approach, the Olympic Village, more the Federer approach, sport for the betterment of humanity. It's not about the individual, it's more about the collective. It's not about winning that gold, it's about trying your best. And I think that we can look at these archetypes in our training, in our lives, and we can, with purpose and intention, approach how we move forward with those in mind, purposefully.
Neuroscience, believe in all that?
Well, I was listening, and what struck me was the idea of being able to change perhaps your path. And we're talking about the title of the book is Sports Gene, and we all know that genes do play a role in who we are and our personality, but definitely the environment and what we create around ourselves is incredibly important. Talking about the plasticity of the brain in the case of fear, for instance, or also in the case of love. The case of fear and anxiety, we tend to be we want to make change about our lives and perhaps override certain patterns of fear. We need to remind ourselves that the brain is plastic, and so we can change the experience or being exposed to the fear.
If you have the plasticity in the brain and you have a way of thinking, a mode of thinking, and so you become more aware of it, does that change your genes as well, the sequencing of it?
Since the time we're born, everything that we experience teaches us something, and experience can actually modify our genes. This is
So you can become a better hero for your own journey. But if I'm 5 foot tall, I'm not going to become an NBA player, correct?
You might, right? As I mentioned in the book, it's like you might. You don't want to say anything about an individual. These are population averages. But
Okay.
if I were an NBA scout, I wouldn't spend my time looking in African pygmy populations where the average adult height is 5 feet tall. That's not to say there will never be someone from that population who can be in the NBA, but on balance, that's not where I would put my attention.
Someone who believes that that is their journey to be an NBA player when they're 4'11", is probably in service to someone else's ideas about what they need to be, and they're not acting from a place consistent with their purpose, their dharma. I was in my backyard with my son, who at the time was about 5 years old, and at that age he had a real interest in reptiles, and he said, "Dad, can we go look for a snake?" And I was not one of my proudest parenting moments. I was busy doing yard work, and I said, "Hey buddy, there aren't any snakes in this yard. If you want to look, that's fine, but I'm doing some work." And as 5-year-old precocious kids do, he kept at it, kept asking me. And finally I kind of lost my temper, and I said to him, "Look, there aren't any snakes in the yard, okay? I've lived here for 13 years. You're not going to find one. Leave me alone." And he kind of waddled off with, a bit of sadness. Maybe a minute or two went by, and he said, "Hey Dad," and I turned and looked, and he's holding a gardener snake in his hands. And so I said to him, "How did you find that snake?" And he said, "Well, it was really easy, Dad. I just decided that I wanted a snake. I really, really, really wanted it. I set all of my heart into finding it. And then I said to myself, if I were the snake, where would I be? And how would I feel? And I felt myself slithering through the grass, so I just reached down in that tall grass over there and pulled myself up without looking." That goes, for me, beyond theory into this world of quantum physics and our ability to, decide in some way, play a role in an outcome. So for an athlete, the underdog or the team that could never win, the athlete that could never potentially make the Olympics, I know training is a huge piece of it, but I wonder how much is also the intentionality, the visualization, and sort of the surrender to just allowing that to manifest.
Some of the things you touched on are sort of outside of my area of expertise, and in some ways outside of testability for the most part, right? But so two people can be doing the same type of training or similar training, and if one is cognitively engaged, they might change their body in a completely different way, right? So it's like going to the golf course or the driving range and smacking a bunch of balls and just not thinking about it is totally different than having cognitive engagement with a certain, keeping the club face at a little different angle when you hit and things like that. And I think that's one of the components of what's now known as deliberate practice, which is the kind of practice that's effortful and error correction focused toward moving you forward. So I think it's pretty clear that all types of practice are not equal, and some of that depends on cognitive engagement.
Deliberate cognitive engagement, mindfulness.
Absolutely. Perhaps I won't go into the quantum physics of it, as you hinted, but even cognitive therapy, so therapy that helps you to contextualize your fears, can help you make a change, and it has been shown that even talk in therapy can have an effect on the physicality of the body, on the activity of certain parts of the brain, for instance the amygdala, which is very much involved in fear. So before and after therapy, there was a change in the reactivity of the amygdala.
The story in your book about this guy who wants to become a PGA player,
Where
is he? Have you still in touch with him?
Oh yeah.
Because you were like 3,000 hours in the book. The story is this guy decided age in the 30 to become a PGA player, right? And through that theory of a 10,000 hour will get you there.
Yeah, so he had read about the 10,000 hour theory, this idea that 10,000 hours of practice is both necessary and sufficient to make anyone an expert in anything. At the time, he was a commercial photographer, and so he decided to ditch that and start from zero practicing golf. At his current pace, he'll probably make it sometime in 2016 to 10,000 hours, and he's become quite good. I think he's about a 6 handicap, which means he's better than most golfers. At the same time, it means he has a long way to go. The reason I sort of told his story in the book is partly to show how this 10,000 hours is coming into practice, when really the underlying science doesn't say anything like it. In the second chapter of the book, which I call 10,000 hours plus or minus 10,000 hours, I tell the story of 2 high jumpers. One of whom, Stephen Holm, became obsessed with high jump as a kid, puts in 20,000 hours by his own estimate. Donald Thomas learns he's a great jumper on a lunchtime bet in college. After 8 months of training, faces Stephen Holm at the World Championships and beat him. So those guys averaged 10,000 hours, right? But one of them was about 0, one of them was about 20,000. And that's actually the variability that you really see in the sport.
Everyone is looking for the same thing at the end of the day. It's like this Pythagoras golden triangle. It's like, where is that magic triangle, that low that no one can see, That where is it lying in the stratosphere that I can discover? Do you find that being driven consciously or not by sort of secret or mythological rules?
At some fundamental level, we all are connected. We all are holistically on the same journey. We're born alone and we will die alone. Those two things are certain.
Yeah.
And in between, each of us struggles with that, and we want to have purpose, and we want to have connection. When we live a life from a place of purpose and intentionality and mindfulness and adherence to our soul's desire, we can not only have beauty and wonder in our lives, but we play a role in shaping the collective and actually helping to repair the world.
Are the black Afro-American, or actually African players, better athletes? Or is this a social, economical problem where the white class, social class, are doing job that pays very well and not really interested in sport, and only the sort of immigrant population can do it, so therefore they are the only one being exposed to the opportunity of playing a game and playing very well?
So there's this idea that, like players that make the NBA are all inner city, deprived guys.
No, but people talk about that.
But actually in the NBA, economic status is positively correlated with making the NBA. Right?
Okay, is it?
As our stable family, as our two-parent families and things like that. So there absolutely are exceptions to that we write about a lot. And I think but it seems like, at least in first world countries, usually for sports, more support is better, not less support. But the guy that won the Chicago Marathon didn't start running until he was 28, I think, in 2010. He was a farmer before that.
Yeah.
If you told an American, like, hey, you know what, I think you might have some ability. I know that you're 27 or 28. Why don't you come out and train? Maybe you'll win the marathon. You'd be like, no, too late.
No, too late, yeah.
So I think it's this combination of social factors, a certain physiology on average, not every person, and this kind of never too late mentality.
So where all the sprinter are coming from Jamaica now?
Yeah, so, and again, that goes to the idea of, you mentioned sort of African athletes, right?
Okay.
Like, most of the world's genetic diversity is contained in Africa.
Yeah,
Because
and the
rest
food
of
as well.
us, right? Like, it's not an exaggeration to say that relative to Africa, all white people look genetically alike.
Sure,
Right.
yeah.
So the Africans that are dominating distance running in East Africa could not be more physiologically dissimilar from the people in West Africa who are overrepresented in sprinting. So to your point, it's not just Jamaica, right? Every man who's been in an Olympic 100-meter final since the boycotted games of 1980, whether it's homelands, Jamaica, US, Canada, Portugal, Netherlands, they're all from one tiny area of West Africa, the coast of West Africa.
Okay.
And in the book, I write about evidence that those people on average have slightly higher fast twitch muscle fiber proportion, which is the kind you need for sprinting. And I discuss in the book evidence that that's kind of a byproduct of a genetic adaptation that protects them from malaria.
Since I was a PhD student and I was working in the lab, I was obsessed with this question: what can science teach me about living? That even Socrates asked himself.
Yeah.
He learned that Anaxagoras was the leading physicist of his time, knew everything about the mind, and then he was disappointed when the molecules Anaxagoras was talking about actually could tell him very little about his existence. And that's something that resonated a lot with me. So that's why I started this journey and talked about all these different emotions, and I say why perhaps philosophy can help me better than neuroscience in understanding anxiety, or maybe Shakespeare and a lapidary poem by Philip Larkin can help me understand love and why we make certain mistakes, and how we learn to love from the lessons of our parents, and also why does it make sense to cultivate joy, to nail down fear? And you talked about connectedness and mindfulness.
You talk about empathy as well. You're skipping that one. That's a big one.
That's right.
Huge. I really I applaud you, because I tried in my book to say that whether you come at it from the perspective of science, sociology, anthropology, spirituality, mythology, or religion, there is a standard set of language that gets explained differently in each of them, but they all point to the same things. We can call it a miracle, we can call it manifestation, we can call it mindfulness or cognitive thinking, but really we're talking about the same things. I love that as a scientist and as a PhD, you also look to art and poetry and philosophy to inform your thinking as to what can science help me learn about how to live. And to the point on fear and the amygdala, there was this great, that I wrote about in the book, this great experiment where this very well-known scientist went to the zoo, and he had a deathly deep fear of snakes. And he stood and looked at this snake at the zoo that was behind like 2 inches.
You
of
have
bulletproof
a lot of
glass.
story with snakes.
Yeah, I know. That's actually a good point.
Mythology, right?
I know, yeah, you go.
Right. There's a lot of snakes in mythology.
That's right.
But he stared at the snake and he said to himself, and this is a smart man, right? And he said over and over again, this snake is behind 2 inches of bulletproof glass. This snake cannot get me. This snake, over and over again for an hour. He repeated it like a mantra. And then he walked up and he pressed his nose against the glass. The snake reared back and jumped at him, and he flew 10 feet back. Because we live from a place often of reaction. You know, fear says 2 things to us only. When you want to do something, fear says, no, you can't do that. And when you're tired and you want to rest, fear says, keep going. And just like that snake, if we live our lives jumping back from the glass, wearing a winter coat when it's not snowing out, because as a kid it was, we live inauthentic lives, and we put a lot of energy into emotions, belief systems, patterns, and ways that we interact in the world that prevent us from heeding our call, which prevents us from having life, but also prevents us from collectively repairing the world.
David, sport in psychology, no matter what mentality, I'm driven, I can do it. Does it pay off at the end? Is it like the 10,000 hours or not?
I think the kind of belief that athletes need is they need a long view to everything, right? Like their goals are usually quite far off, so they have to have some intrinsic love of what they're doing because the goals are far away. And there's a lot of micro goal setting for elite athletes. Like they're not saying, 6 years from now I'm going to run the mile in whatever time, right? They're saying they set goals that are doable. That's like you run the race and either you did run that time or you didn't.
Okay.
More often the best will say like when the bell rings for the last lap, I'm going to make a move for the next 100 meters. Like that's something you can do or not do when it comes around. That's like an actionable
micro
goal.
measure,
And I've found that to be like incredibly common among elite athletes. It's kind of actionable micro goals.
So in your research and study in sport and these elite athletes, did you have an opportunity at all to learn about why they do it?
I think anyone who's ever been in a training group of any kind realizes that some people need to be managed in order to train more, and some people need to be managed in order to train less.
Yeah, it's less,
and I think there are some known kind of environmental manipulations that can change that for people. I think a lot of athletes training groups that kind of really become families or peer groups can be really, really motivating. And when those go away, you almost see them go cold turkey from training in some way.
Giovanni, writing your book was helpful to train you in emotion?
Oh, yes.
Are you an improved human being now?
I learned a lot about myself, about my feelings.
Okay.
I recognize people's emotions.
You're not Caravaggio?
I'm not Caravaggio, although I'll talk about Caravaggio. How
I know.
Caravaggio helped me to understand guilt and disappointed a friend, and was more helpful than an fMRI on guilt. And I think ultimately what I learned is really that we really need to choose between science and art. I always say that it's possible to be at once scientific and lyrical. We talked a little bit about education and how, unfortunately, our schools are just too specialized.
You see Google, great companies now hiring more masters of fine arts than they are masters of business. Because I think they're recognizing that there is an integration that needs to happen, and that there's this bright line that we're, in first grade, if a teacher asks the students, how many of you want to be artists? Out of a classroom of 20, 16 to 17 will raise your hand. In third grade, if you ask that same question, 3 will raise their hand. Somehow in between those years, they're told, if you want to be an artist, you'll be a part of that group that goes on that table and plays with glue and glitters. And just be prepared, you're going to be poor. And we need those people in our lives. And one of the things that I'm really interested in and have personally been exploring is this notion that there are feelings, but we are not our feelings. And that you can be the neutral observer of your feelings. You can watch them. But then if you're watching your thoughts or your feelings, inherently that means you're not them.
Marathon runner, I think, use that technique of a second breath, they call it sort of self-hypnosis.
Oh yeah.
To disconnect from their own body and emotion.
I'm not the pain. I'm the observer of the pain.
And I wouldn't use the word disconnect because it actually appears that they connect more.
Whereas, more in depth.
Whereas more novice athletes are often trying to sort of dissociate from what their body's going through. Whereas elite athletes are actually tuning into it and kind of keeping their mind calm while their body's even in distress. So I think the word dissociation is almost sort of like a bad word among
It's almost hyper-association.
Yeah.
They're able to observe what's going on, understand it, and as a result, the pain or the suffering in the body doesn't own them.
Right.
They witness it and understand it.
Right. In some cases, it almost becomes like an embracing of pain, because you sort of know that's what's making you better, or at least a lack of fear of pain that a lot of novices have.
Yeah. I read 3 days of books. I'm sure my genes are made for me to write and read books. But thank you all for coming at Books du Jour. And I'm going to wrap up with Giovanni Frazzetto, Joy, Guilt, Anger, and Love, which is out on for Penguin. The Sport Gym by David Epstein, which should be coming on paperback when?
Beginning of May.
Beginning of May, okay. A new book just came out a couple of days ago, David Howitt, Hate to Call. Thank you all for being my guest today and sharing a little bit of food on Books du Jour and shaking hands. And we can clap and hug each other. And we have jeans designed for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This program was brought to you in part by City Winery.